Welcome to this deep dive, brought to you by Ben's Book Summaries.
Hey there.
So, you've handed us Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, a pretty significant book.
Definitely. It's one that certainly gets people talking.
Right, and our job today is to really get into the core of it for you, the listener. We'll pull out the main arguments, the key takeaways, maybe some of those moments people often quote.
And look at why it's still relevant, why it still sparks so much discussion today.
Exactly. So, where do we start? Zinn's approach is famously different.
It really is. The whole premise is history told from the bottom up,
Yeah.
focusing on the voices usually left out, workers, slaves, indigenous peoples, women, and he kicks things off by tackling Columbus.
Okay, Columbus. Not the celebratory version many of us learned in school, I take it.
Not at all. Zinn wants us to see Columbus's arrival through the eyes of the Arawak people he encountered in the Bahamas. And, well, it's a harrowing picture.
He relies heavily on Bartolome de las Casas for this, doesn't he?
Yes, absolutely. And Las Casas is such a compelling figure. He was there. He initially took part in the conquest of Cuba,
Right.
but then he had this profound change of heart. He renounced the Spanish cruelty, became a fierce critic, and dedicated his life to documenting it. He even transcribed Columbus's own journal.
That gives his account incredible weight, doesn't it? Someone who saw it from the inside.
Exactly. And what he describes is just. The speed of the devastation is staggering. Zinn highlights the figures. Maybe 250,000 Arawaks initially, down to 50,000 by 1515, maybe 500 left by 1550.
And practically none by 1650. It's almost complete annihilation.
And Zinn is clear this wasn't just accidental disease, though that played a part. It was the encomienda system, forced labor.
Explain that a bit, the encomiendas system.
Well, basically, the Spanish crown granted colonists the right to forcibly use indigenous labor. Sounds sort of bureaucratic, but in reality, it meant working people to death in mines on plantations. It was brutal.
And Las Casas described the Arawaks themselves quite differently from the usual savage narrative, right?
Yeah, he talks about them being agile, good swimmers, especially the women. Not, perfectly peaceful, they had their own conflicts, but small scale, based on individual grievances, not commands from rulers, a stark contrast to how they were being treated.
So Zinn's argument is that choosing to focus on Columbus the hero while downplaying this genocide, that's an ideological choice.
Precisely. He says, look, it's not about putting Columbus on trial today. The danger is accepting atrocities as just the necessary price of progress.
That's a heavy point.
It is. And he draws parallels. He asks, if we accept this logic for Columbus, why not for, say, Hiroshima or Vietnam, or actions by states like the Soviets in Kronstadt or Hungary? It's about the justification itself.
The idea that you can bury terrible things under a mountain of other facts make them seem less important.
Right. Or just unavoidable. Zinn wants us to reject that. He says we shouldn't accept the memory of states as our own memory. History isn't one unified story.
It's a story of conflict.
Yeah, conflict between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated by race, by sex. He argues these conflicts are central,
And he quotes Albert Camus.
saying that for thinking people, the choice should be not to be on the side of the executioners. That really sets the tone for the whole book, looking at history from the perspective of those who suffered under power.
Okay, so that perspective shapes how he looks at the English colonization, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He gives the example of Richard Grenville in Virginia, 1585. An Indian supposedly steals a silver cup. Grenville's response:
What was it?
sack and burn the entire village. A completely disproportionate, violent reaction that sets a pattern.
And Jamestown.
Yeah.
Established right in Powhatan territory.
Right. Powhatan was initially cautious, kept his distance. But then you have the starving time in 1610.
Where the English colonists were literally starving to death.
And some actually fled to the Indians looking for food. It shows how vulnerable the English were and how dependent, really.
And Powhatan wasn't exactly eager to send them back, was he? Zinn mentions his proud and disdainful answers.
Yeah, he seemed to know the score. But the English response to runaways or any perceived defiance was, again, incredibly brutal.
Tell us about that.
Zinn recounts an English attack on an Indian settlement, killing 15 or 16 people, burning houses, destroying corn, and then this horrific detail about throwing the captured queen's children overboard and shooting them in the water before stabbing the queen herself.
That's chillingly brutal.
It really is. It shows a complete dehumanization. But Zinn also points out it wasn't just the Indians suffering. He cites a petition from Jamestown colonists under Governor Sir Thomas Smith.
What did it say?
It described awful conditions, meager, rotten food, and incredibly harsh punishments for tiny offenses like stealing oatmeal could get you hanged, shot, broken on the wheel, or even have your tongue pierced with a hot iron.
So life was brutal even for many of the English settlers.
Yes, and Zinn uses this to set the stage for slavery. This existing culture of extreme exploitation and dehumanization made the enslavement of Africans seem, perhaps, like a logical next step for those in power.
He talks about the specific vulnerability of Africans being forcibly removed.
Right. Their settled cultures, complex societies, family ties, all systematically destroyed. Captured inland, often by other Africans involved in the trade, marched to the coast, held in pens with people who didn't even speak the same language.
There's a description by John Barbo.
Yes, of the cages on the Gold Coast, the degrading physical examinations by ship surgeons, the branding with hot irons, then back into the pens. Pure commodification.
And the journey itself, the Middle Passage.
Unimaginable horror. Cramped beyond belief, chained, darkness, the stench of sickness and death. Mortality rates were enormous. Zinn emphasizes this wasn't accidental, it was the cost of maximizing profit.
Profit which was substantial for the enslavers.
Immense. Zinn cites James Madison calculating he could make $257 a year from each slave while spending only $12 or $13 on their upkeep. It was the economic engine of the South.
But Zinn also pushes back against the idea of slaves being completely passive, right? The Sambo stereotype.
Absolutely. He acknowledges large-scale revolts were rare and brutally suppressed, but highlights constant, everyday resistance. Slowing down work, breaking tools, running away. These were acts of defiance, ways of asserting humanity against the system.
Which connects to his next major theme, how racial division was actively constructed.
Yes, this is crucial for Zinn. He argues the Virginia ruling class deliberately created a racial wedge between poor whites and enslaved blacks to prevent them from uniting against the elite.
How did they do that?
By creating legal and social distinctions, offering white indentured servants things black people were denied, freedom dues like corn, money, a gun, maybe even land after their service. It created a psychological buy-in for poor whites, a sense of superiority, even if they were still exploited.
So it wasn't just inherent prejudice, but a strategy.
That's Zinn's argument. He points to fears expressed by the Virginia House of Burgesses around 1700 about the worser sort of European servants, especially the Irish, potentially rebelling.
And Bacon's rebellion in 1676 kind of proved their fears were valid.
Exactly. That was a huge shock. White frontiersmen, joined by black slaves and white servants, rising up together against the governor and the wealthy planters. It showed the potential power of a united lower class.
Zinn mentions Nathaniel Bacon appealing to the vulgar and most ignorant people.
Right. And there's evidence from earlier colonial records laws being passed specifically to prevent black and white servant slaves from running away together. It shows that solidarity was happening.
So the ruling class had to actively work to break it down.
Yes. Things like deficiency laws requiring plantations to have a certain number of white servants to oversee black slaves, bringing in more white servants, even convicts transported from Britain after 1717, helped create this buffer class.
And the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion is telling, too.
Very telling. White rebels were eventually pardoned, but black participants faced harsher consequences. Laws were passed forbidding blacks from carrying arms. The lines were being drawn much more sharply. Status based on race became a deliberate tool of control.
Okay, so let's shift to the American Revolution. Zinn's take is different here, too.
Yeah, he sees it less as a unified fight for liberty, and more as the colonial elite mobilizing popular anger against Britain to serve their own interests while managing internal class conflicts.
So using the anger of the poor, but not necessarily empowering them.
Largely, yes. He points to pre-revolution conflicts like tenant riots against wealthy landlords in New Jersey and New York, even the rebellion that led to Vermont's creation. These showed deep class resentment already existed.
Even the famous Boston protests against the Stamp Act.
Zinn notes that leaders like Sam Adams got nervous. They whipped up the mob, but then worried the popular fury was getting out of hand, potentially turning against the colonial elite themselves. General Gage observed this too.
And after the Revolution, did the class structure fundamentally change?
Not really, according to Zinn. The old loyalist elite were replaced by new patriot elites, merchants, lawyers, land speculators. He cites historian Edmund Morgan saying it was largely a struggle for office and power within the upper class.
And Richard Morris's point about we the people.
Right. That phrase in the Constitution famously excluded huge groups: Native Americans, enslaved blacks, women, even white indentured servants, whose numbers actually increased after the revolution for a time.
Let's talk more about Native Americans and women. Zinn tracks the shift from some level of coexistence pre-1750.
To increasing pressure from westward expansion, land became the major flashpoint.
Yeah.
He gives the example of 800,000 acres of Mohawk land in New York, just basically swindled away.
And that bitter speech by Chief Hendrick in 1753.
Declaring the covenant chain, the alliance with the colonists broken. A powerful moment showing the betrayal felt by tribes who had tried to cooperate.
So Zinn argues the Constitution essentially locked in these existing hierarchies.
Pretty much. The supremacy of the rich, the exclusion of Indians, the subordination of blacks. These were established patterns solidified by the new nation's founding documents, despite what celebratory historians like George Bancroft wrote about equality.
And women were largely invisible in these narratives.
Exactly. Zinn makes a point of bringing them in. He quotes Hannah Mather Crocker, wishing women could simply obtain a character as a human being regardless of sex. A very basic but denied aspiration.
He does note that in early pre-industrial America, practical needs sometimes led to women having more varied roles.
Yes, on the frontier especially. Women ran taverns, print shops, tanneries, worked as midwives. Necessity created opportunities, but then came the 19th century.
And the cult of true womanhood.
Right. Around the 1820s, this ideology emerges strongly, pushing women back into the domestic sphere. Piety, purity, submissiveness, domesticity, those were the prescribed virtues. Zinn quotes magazines like The Ladies' Repository, pushing this ideal.
It sounds like a way to control women as society changed.
That's the interpretation. Keep women in their place. But Zinn also highlights resistance.
Like the Lowell Mill girls.
Yeah, factory workers in Massachusetts protesting horrific conditions, long hours, low pay. They even published their own writings, the factory tracts, explicitly comparing their situation to slavery. And there were mass meetings, like one in New York in 1845. Women were organizing.
Okay, let's move into the era of westward expansion and Indian removal under Andrew Jackson.
Jackson looms large here. Zinn starts with the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 against the Creek Nation. Ironically, Jackson was helped by Cherokee warriors who'd been promised U.S. friendship.
And after the battle, did Jackson reward his allies?
Hardly. He and his friends snapped up the seized Creek lands. Then Jackson imposed a treaty taking half the land of the entire Creek Nation, hitting allies and enemies alike.
What was his justification?
When Creek leader Big Warrior protested, Jackson basically said the Creeks hadn't respected U.S. power enough, so they deserved it. It showed a complete disregard for treaties or prior alliances when land was involved.
And this set the stage for the wider policy of Indian removal.
Yes. Zinn discusses the debate around it. Figures like Lewis Cass, who later became Secretary of War, actually acknowledged that removal would likely fail in the long run and lead to the Indians' extinction, but argued for it anyway.
That's incredibly cynical.
It is. Zinn contrasts this with quotes from Indigenous leaders expressing their deep spiritual connection to their ancestral lands, saying they couldn't sell the ground where their ancestors were buried.
But the pressure continued.
Relentlessly. White settlers, squatters, whiskey sellers flooded into creek lands in Alabama and Georgia, often defrauding people. The federal government did little to stop it, essentially allowing the pressure to build until removal seemed inevitable.
Which leads to the Trail of Tears.
The forced removal of the Cherokee in 1838. Zinn describes the terrible conditions people rounded up into stockades with minimal food and sanitation, then forced to march west in winter. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died on the way. He includes a quote from Chief John Ross about the suffering. It's a brutal chapter.
Following that, Zinn tackles the Mexican War. How does he frame that conflict?
As a war of aggression driven by U.S. expansionism, particularly the desire for California. He notes how President Polk sent troops under Zachary Taylor into disputed territory between Texas and Mexico.
Setting up a provocation.
That's the implication. When a U.S. patrol was attacked in that disputed zone, Polk declared Mexico had shed American blood upon the American soil and called for war.
But Zinn includes dissenting voices.
Yes, significantly. Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who was with Taylor's army, wrote in his diary that the U.S. was clearly the aggressor and the war felt wrong.
And Polk's own diary
reveals he wanted a declaration of war before that specific skirmish even happened, based on Mexico rejecting a U.S. negotiator and owing money to American citizens. The battle was a convenient pretext.
Was there much opposition to the war at home?
There was. Zinn quotes abolitionists like Theodore Parker, denouncing it as a war to expand slavery. Newspapers like the Advocate of Peace and William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator condemned it. There were anti-war meetings, though sometimes met with mob violence.
And racist justifications were used, too.
Oh, absolutely. Congressman Delano argued against annexing Mexico because Americans shouldn't mix with an inferior people. Racism fueled the expansionist drive.
How popular was the war, really? Newspapers claimed widespread support.
Zinn is skeptical. He points out enlistments dwindled after the initial rush. Election results in 1846 were mixed. Many enlisted simply because they needed work, or were lured by promises of pay and land grants, not necessarily out of patriotic fervor.
And the soldiers' experience.
Often grim. Volunteers complained about poor treatment compared to regulars. Battle accounts, like of Churubusco, describe horrific carnage. A Marine lieutenant criticized General Winfield Scott for needless slaughter. Desertion rates were high on both sides.
Okay, let's turn towards the Civil War. Zinn looks at the lead-up, focusing on resistance to slavery.
Right. He highlights things like the Creole incident in 1841, where enslaved people being transported on a U.S. ship overpowered the crew and sailed to the British Bahamas where they were freed.
That caused quite a stir, didn't it? Talk of war with Britain.
It did. And Zinn quotes a black newspaper questioning why black people should fight for a government that denied them basic rights.
He also emphasizes the role of black abolitionists, particularly women.
Yes, citing Sojourner Truth's powerful speech at an 1853 Women's Rights Convention, challenging assumptions about gender and strength, demanding equality.
How does Zinn portray Lincoln's position on slavery before the war?
As quite moderate, even conservative from an abolitionist perspective. Lincoln opposed slavery's expansion, but wasn't initially for abolishing it where it existed. He supported colonization, sending freed slaves back to Africa. He famously said he'd bite my lips and keep quiet about enforcing the fugitive slave law.
Wendell Phillips called him that slave hound from Illinois.
A harsh assessment, but it reflects abolitionist frustration with Lincoln's caution. Zinn argues the Emancipation Proclamation was more a strategic war measure than a purely moral act initially.
And even during the war, there were deep divisions in the North. The draft riots.
Yes, the 1863 draft riots in New York and other cities were brutal. Poor white immigrants, often Irish, resented that wealthier men could pay $300 to avoid the draft. Their anger turned violently against black people, who they scapegoated.
Black soldiers faced discrimination, too.
Big time. They fought for the Union, but were initially paid less than white soldiers. Zinn tells the story of Sergeant William Walker, who led a protest against unequal pay and was court-martialed and shot for mutiny. Equal pay was only granted in 1864.
Even the Confederacy considered using black soldiers near the end.
Desperate times. They debated enlisting slaves with the promise of freedom, but it was too little, too late.
And after the war, the promise of 40 acres and a mule.
Largely broken. Zinn describes the situation on the Sea Islands off South Carolina, where General Sherman had issued Special Field Order No. 15, setting aside land for freedmen. But President Andrew Johnson overturned it. Freed people asking where Lincoln symbolized that betrayal.
He quotes an ex-slave, Thomas Hall,
saying emancipation without economic independence, without land, wasn't true freedom, you were still dependent.
So Zinn's overall view of the Civil War.
That it started primarily to preserve the Union and national territory economy, not to end slavery. But the dynamics of the war itself, the actions of slaves, the need for black soldiers, and the abolitionist crusade pushed it towards emancipation and raised questions of racial equality, even if those questions were ultimately betrayed in Reconstruction.
Let's talk about Reconstruction and its betrayal. Zinn contrasts the reality with racist historical views.
Right. He mentioned scholars like John Burgess at Columbia, who dismissed Reconstruction as a disaster caused by ignorant black rule. Zinn counters this by highlighting the achievements of black leaders elected in the South.
Like Henry McNeill Turner.
Yes, a remarkable figure. Self-educated, elected to the Georgia legislature, then illegally expelled along with other black members simply because of their race. His speech denouncing the expulsion was incredibly powerful.
And despite the rise of violence and the Klan, black resistance continued.
Zinn emphasizes this. Even in the face of lynchings and hopelessness in the 1880s, black communities held meetings, sent petitions, appealed for justice. It wasn't passive acceptance.
He also points to black leaders who challenged Booker T. Washington's more accommodationist approach.
Like John Hope, president of Atlanta University, who insisted on demanding full social equality, not just economic progress.
And W.E.B. Du Bois' analysis.
Du Bois saw the betrayal of black Reconstruction, not just as racism, but as part of the rise of a new industrial capitalism that sought to control labor, both black and white. He wrote poetically about God and the world weeping over this betrayal.
Zinn connects this to broader class conflicts in the late 19th century. It goes back even earlier sometimes.
Yeah, he brings in things like the Anti-Ant War in New York in the 1840s, tenant farmers fighting, sometimes violently using guerrilla tactics dressed as Indians against the descendants of feudal landlords. It shows deep-seated class antagonism.
And the rise of a new middle class?
The white-collar workers, professionals. Zinn suggests they often align themselves with the interests of the wealthy, creating a buffer. Meanwhile, agriculture was mechanizing, displacing farmers.
He mentions urban unrest, too, like the Flour Riot of 1837.
During a depression in New York City, severe unemployment, people starving, attacking warehouses storing flour, it highlights the desperation economic crises inflicted.
And the challenges faced by immigrants.
Particularly the Irish fleeing the famine in the 1840s. Zinn describes the horrific conditions on the ships bringing them over, sometimes as bad as slave ships. They faced intense prejudice and exploitation upon arrival.
Labor organizing started early, but faced setbacks.
Yes, like the Lowell strikes in the 1830s, demanding better wages and shorter hours. The Female Labor Reform Association emerged from that. But Zinn argues the Civil War temporarily sidetracked labor militancy, focusing attention on national issues over class ones.
But strikes reemerged during the war.
Yes, driven by wartime inflation and exploitation, unions formed. But then you also had the draft riots again, showing how class and race could be manipulated against workers' solidarity. Zinn quotes a graphic description of the violence in New York.
The human cost of the war was immense.
Staggering. Zinn emphasizes this, and he argues patriotism and the moral crusade against slavery were used, consciously or not, to obscure class resentments and mobilize the population for a war that also greatly benefited Northern business interests.
He cites Edmund Wilson's analogy.
Comparing the nation during the war to a school of fish easily distracted or grasshoppers easily scattered, class consciousness was overshadowed.
And legislation during the war favored business.
Things like the Morrill Tariff, land grants for railroads, a National Bank Act, all helped consolidate corporate power.
After the war, did unrest continue?
Yes. Unemployment soared after demobilization. Protests erupted in cities like New York and Chicago. Zinn describes the Tompkins Square riot in 1874, where police violently attacked a demonstration of the unemployed.
And the Molly Maguires.
In the Pennsylvania coal fields. A secret society of Irish miners accused of violence against mine owners. Zinn presents the view that they were likely framed labor organizers, targeted for their effectiveness in the long strike against brutal conditions.
Which leads to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877.
A massive, spontaneous uprising triggered by wage cuts. It spread across the country. Zinn details the violence workers clashing with militia and federal troops ordered in by President Hayes. Scores of strikers were killed. It showed the state siding decisively with capital.
And the government was actively supporting railroad development.
Hugely. Land grants, loans. Zinn mentions the Union Pacific and the credit mobilier scandal, where politicians profited corruptly from these subsidies.
Moving into the Gilded Age, the era of monopolies.
Right. Zinn quotes robber baron Jay Gould, expressing confidence that President Grover Cleveland, despite campaign rhetoric, would protect business interests. And he did, appointing pro-business figures.
So monopolies grew stronger?
Yes, immense consolidation. Bankers like J.P. Morgan gained enormous influence, controlling vast networks of railroads, industries. Rockefeller dominated oil.
And dissent was suppressed.
Vigorously. Zinn talks about the industrial workers of the world, the IWW or Wobblies, and their free speech fights. Towns in the West would pass ordinances banning public speaking to stop union organizers.
How did the IWW fight back?
They'd flood the town with members who would deliberately get arrested for speaking, filling the jails until the town couldn't afford it anymore. Zinn includes accounts of the terrible jail conditions and the Wobblies' defiant resistance, singing songs, refusing to work.
The IWW was known for organizing inclusively, too.
Very much so. Unlike many AFL unions at the time, they welcomed immigrants, black workers, unskilled laborers. Zinn highlights their role in the massive Lawrence, Massachusetts textile strike, bread and roses, and organizing timber workers in the South, where leader Bill Haywood famously refused to speak to segregated audiences.
There were other radical voices, too.
People like Emma Goldman, the anarchist feminist, or Helen Keller, who became a socialist and advocated for direct action, challenging the system beyond just electoral politics.
It sounds like business felt pretty secure in its power.
Zinn quotes the Banker's magazine in 1901, basically saying politicians were becoming clerks and messengers for business. And even progressivism under figures like Herbert Croly, Zinn argues, was about government regulating business just enough to stabilize the system and prevent more radical upheaval, not fundamentally challenge corporate power.
Let's shift to U.S. expansionism around the turn of the century and World War I.
Zinn links this to the growing need for overseas markets for American goods, the idea of an open-door policy access for U.S. business everywhere.
And influential figures push for expansion.
Yes, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan argued naval power was key to global dominance. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge pushed for controlling strategic spots like Hawaii and Cuba.
Which brings us to the Spanish-American War.
Ostensibly fought to help Cuban rebels gain independence from Spain. But Zinn, citing historian William Appleman Williams, suggests it was more complex. A three-way fight where the U.S. intervened partly to ensure Cuba wouldn't become too independent and might fall outside U.S. economic influence.
So replacing Spanish control with American influence.
Pretty much. U.S. businesses poured into Cuba after the war. And when Cuban workers went on strike during the American military occupation, the U.S. Army suppressed them.
And the war extended to the Philippines.
Yes. After defeating Spain, the U.S. fought a brutal war to crush the Filipino independence movement led by Emilio Aguinaldo. Zinn cites estimates of enormous Filipino casualties, possibly hundreds of thousands, from fighting, disease, and atrocities. One general reportedly said a sixth of the population of Luzon had been killed or died.
Was this brutality acknowledged back home?
There were reports, but officials like Secretary of War Elihu Root largely denied them or downplayed them.
By the early 1900s, corporate power was really entrenched.
Absolutely. Figures like J.P. Morgan were organizing huge trusts, consolidating industries, seeking stability and predictability for big business.
Then came World War I. How did that affect the U.S. economy?
It created a huge boom, massive profits for corporations like U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, DuPont. But Zinn points out wages for workers didn't keep pace. The rich got much richer.
And the government managed the war economy.
Through agencies like the War Industries Board, headed by Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch, Zinn argues this put the economy directly under the control of big business interests for the duration of the war.
What about dissent against the war?
Severely repressed under the Espionage Act of 1917. Zinn details the prosecution of thousands for speaking out against the war or the draft.
Including Eugene V. Debs.
Yes, the prominent socialist leader. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech opposing the war. Zinn includes parts of Debs' powerful statement to the court, defending free speech and socialism.
After the war, was there a fear of radicalism?
A huge fear, the Red Scare. Zinn argues the government used a combination of reform, like limited labor laws, and repression, like raids and deportations, to control dissent and weaken the socialist and labor movements that had gained strength.
Moving into the 1920s, Zinn describes stark class divisions.
He uses the example of Muncie, Indiana, from the sociological study Middletown, contrasting the lives of the business class with the working class. Despite the image of the Roaring Twenties, he argues most people saw only limited gains in real income. Mass media, controlled by large corporations, promoted consumerism and conformity.
But there were critical voices in literature.
Yes, writers like Theodore Dreiser, Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Zinn quotes Fitzgerald's observations in The Great Gatsby about the carelessness and emptiness of the wealthy elite living on borrowed time. Lewis's Babbitt satirized shallow consumer culture.
And activism continued on some fronts.
He mentions anti-fascist immigrant groups supporting Sacco and Vanzetti, the anarchists executed controversially in 1927, and communists were involved in trying to organize labor, facing immense challenges.
Then the Great Depression hits.
Devastating impact. Mass unemployment, homelessness, hunger. Zinn emphasizes the suffering of ordinary people.
How does he view Roosevelt's New Deal?
As providing relief and making some reforms, but ultimately limited. He argues it didn't fundamentally challenge corporate power. For instance, the National Recovery Administration, NRA, often reinforced the power of big business within industries. The goal was to save capitalism, not transform it.
But the 1930s also saw a surge in labor militancy.
A huge surge. Zinn details the wave of successful, often violent strikes in 1934, the Teamsters in Minneapolis, the Autolite workers in Toledo, the Longshoremen's general strike in San Francisco. These showed renewed worker power.
And the sit-down strikes.
A major innovation starting around 1936. Workers occupying factories, preventing production, and strike breakers. Zinn describes the famous Flint sit-down strike against General Motors, the community support, The organization inside the plants, it was incredibly effective.
Leading to the rise of the CIO.
Yes, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which organized entire industries, auto, steel, rubber, and challenged the AFL's more conservative focus on skilled craft unions. Zinn also notes the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, establishing a minimum wage and maximum hours as a result of this pressure.
Okay, let's turn to World War II and the Cold War. How does Zinn approach the rise of fascism?
Critically of U.S. policy, he notes the State Department's inaction on Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, U.S. oil sales fueling Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and the official neutrality during the Spanish Civil War that effectively helped Franco's fascists win. He suggests U.S. policy was driven more by economic interests and anti-communism than opposition to fascism itself.
And U.S. aims during the war.
Zinn argues a key goal was to emerge as the dominant global economic power, surpassing Britain. He points to the focus on securing access to Middle East oil, like Roosevelt approving Lend-Lease aid to Saudi Arabia, specifically to benefit the American oil company Aramco.
Did labor unrest continue during WWII?
Yes. Despite no strike pledges by union leaders, there were numerous wildcat strikes over wages and conditions. Corporate profits soared during the war, far outpacing wage increases, and strikes surged again immediately after the war ended.
Zinn also addresses the bombing campaigns.
He discusses the Allied saturation bombing of German cities, particularly the firebombing of Dresden, questioning its military necessity and highlighting the immense civilian death toll.
And Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
He presents the arguments questioning the necessity of the atomic bombs, suggesting Japan was already close to surrender and that the bombings may have been partly aimed at intimidating the Soviet Union.
After the war comes the Cold War and McCarthyism.
Zinn argues the anti-communist crusade was used to justify massive military spending, global interventionism, and suppression of dissent at home. McCarthyism created a climate of fear that crippled the left and labor movements.
He mentions specific cases.
The Rosenberg case, where Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for espionage based on controversial evidence, and the investigations by the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, which ruined careers and enforced political conformity.
And the Truman Doctrine.
Zinn sees it as the formal start of the Cold War, committing the U.S. to a global role of opposing communism anywhere, often by supporting undemocratic regimes aligned with U.S. interests.
Let's move to the Civil Rights Movement. How does Zinn frame its origins?
As rooted in the deep historical memory of slavery and continued humiliation, but gaining new momentum after WWII. He notes Truman's order desegregating the armed forces was partly motivated by needing black soldiers' morale for the Cold War and securing black votes.
But real change was slow.
Very slow, which led to the rise of direct action and black rebellion in the South in the early 60s and later in northern cities. Zinn highlights the Montgomery bus boycott and Martin Luther King Jr.'s emergence, quoting King's powerful speeches connecting their struggle to history.
And the role of groups like SNCC.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Zinn emphasizes their grassroots organizing, voter registration drives in dangerous areas like Mississippi, the sit-ins, freedom rides, and the intense violence they faced. He includes moving accounts, like a blind man wanting to learn the literacy test to vote.
Freedom Summer, the March on Washington.
Key moments. Zinn contrasts King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech with the originally planned, more militant speech by SNCC leader John Lewis, which was toned down under pressure, and Malcolm X's critique of the march as being co-opted.
The violence continued, like the Birmingham church bombing.
A horrific act that killed 4 young girls. Zinn argues these events and the slow federal response fueled growing impatience and militancy,
leading to urban uprisings like Watts in 1965.
Yes. Zinn sees Watts not as a random riot, but as an explosion of anger against police brutality and systemic racism and poverty, a shift towards more forceful resistance, as one resident put it, no longer turning the other cheek.
But Zinn notes these riots had limited impact on changing conditions.
Right, and he points to things like the Boston busing crisis of the 1970s as an example of how limited government concessions could be used to pit poor whites against poor blacks, diverting attention from systemic inequality.
Shifting now to the Vietnam War, Zinn starts with Vietnamese independence.
Yes, highlighting Ho Chi Minh declaring independence from France in 1945, even quoting the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But the U.S. ultimately backed the French colonialists and then intervened directly after the French defeat.
Why did the U.S. get involved?
Zinn points to strategic and economic interests containing communism, securing access to resources like tin, rubber, oil in Southeast Asia, maintaining U.S. credibility as a global power, the domino theory.
He details the brutality of the U.S. war effort.
The immense bombing campaigns, the use of napalm and Agent Orange, the high civilian casualties. He cites reports from provinces like Quang Ngai, later the site of the My Lai massacre.
My Lai is a key example he uses.
Yes, the deliberate killing of hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians by U.S. soldiers. Zinn includes harrowing testimony from soldiers who were there, like James Dursey.
Was there resistance within the military?
Increasingly so, as the war dragged on. Zinn mentions officers like Lt. Richard Steinke refusing to board a bombing mission, soldiers court-martialed for refusing deployment, the rise of GI coffee houses and underground newspapers opposing the war.
And Ron Kovich.
The Marine veteran whose book Born on the 4th of July Zinn discusses. Kovich went from patriotic enlistee to being paralyzed in combat, then became a powerful anti-war activist. His story connected deeply with the anti-war novel Johnny Got His Gun.
How significant was the anti-war movement at home?
Hugely significant, Zinn argues. Massive protests, draft resistance, civil disobedience. President Nixon initially dismissed the protesters, but Zinn cites evidence that the movement significantly constrained Nixon's options and ultimately contributed to the U.S. withdrawal.
Zinn's conclusion on Vietnam.
That the U.S. lost the war not just militarily in Vietnam, but politically at home. A combination of Vietnamese resistance and the domestic protest movement defeated the world's superpower.
Okay, let's cover the later 20th century other movements. Watergate, the end of the Cold War. Zinn discusses the modern women's movement.
Yes, seeing a pattern. Women gained some freedom during times of national need, like WWII industry or social upheaval, but faced backlash trying to push them back into traditional roles afterwards.
Post-WWII trends.
More women entered the workforce but faced lower pay, discrimination, limited opportunities. Zinn quotes feminist sociologist Alice Rossi observing in 1964 a lack of a visible feminist spark, despite underlying dissatisfaction.
Where did that spark come from?
Partly from women's experiences within other movements, like civil rights, where they often played crucial but secondary roles. Then came influential books like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, identifying the problem that has no name among middle-class housewives.
He also cites Adrienne Rich.
Yes, on how society trains women towards passivity, using their bodies as resources. Rich's analysis, citing examples like Little Women, resonated with many.
Zinn covers prison rebellions, too.
Especially in the 60s and early 70s, culminating in the Attica prison uprising in 1971, which was brutally suppressed. He connects this to a long history of failed prison reforms and inhumane conditions.
And Native American resistance.
He notes a resurgence of Native populations and activism, rejecting assimilation. Groups used both direct action, like the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973, and elements of white culture, like newspapers, Akwesasne notes, to assert sovereignty and rights. He includes quotes from figures like Chief Luther Standing Bear and Vine Delory Jr.'s critiques of non-Indian thinking.
In Watergate, how does Zinn interpret that scandal?
As revealing deep corruption at the highest levels, but ultimately showing the system protecting itself. Nixon resigned, but received a pardon. Investigations revealed illegal FBI and CIA activities, but fundamental structures remained unchanged. Accountability was limited.
The end of the Vietnam War didn't bring peace.
Zinn points to the Massacres incident soon after, where President Ford ordered military action to rescue a U.S. merchant ship seized by Cambodia, even after knowing the crew would be released. More American lives were lost in the rescue than were on the ship, raising questions about using military force for political appearances.
Public trust in government declined.
Sharply in the mid-70s, fueled by Vietnam, Watergate, economic problems like inflation and unemployment.
How does he view the Carter presidency?
As talking about human rights, but often continuing to support repressive regimes, like the Shah's Iran or Indonesia, when U.S. economic or strategic interests were involved.
And Reagan.
Zinn portrays Reagan's policies as favoring corporate profits, cutting social programs, building up the military, and exacerbating inequality. He quotes economist Wassily Leontief, predicting the massive deficits Reagan's budget would create.
The end of the Cold War, a missed opportunity.
That's the argument Zinn presents, citing Noam Chomsky. The U.S. could have pursued a peace dividend, but instead maintained high military spending and sought new justifications for global intervention, framing the Cold War itself as mainly a pretext to counter independent nationalism worldwide.
Like the first Persian Gulf War.
Zinn questions the necessity of that war, suggesting evidence showed economic sanctions against Iraq were working and the war was driven more by political motives and control of oil.
But resistance continued through these years.
Yes, Zinn highlights the growing anti-nuclear movement, acts of civil disobedience like the plowshares, 8 damaging missile components, widespread public concern about nuclear war, also resistance to draft registration in the 80s.
Protests against U.S. foreign policy.
Significant protests against Reagan's interventions in Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and widespread campus activism against apartheid in South Africa, which eventually helped push Congress to impose sanctions over Reagan's veto.
Does public opinion align with policy?
Often not, Zinn argues. Polls frequently showed support for cutting military spending and increasing aid to the poor, but both major parties largely ignored this.
He emphasizes local activism.
Yes, things like Lois Gibbs organizing homeowners at Love Canal against toxic waste, leading to the National Superfund program. Protesters challenging CIA recruitment on campuses. The rise of public interest law firms fighting for environmental or consumer rights.
And the women's movement continued to evolve.
Focusing on issues like workplace equality, reproductive rights, and challenging violence against women. Zinn notes the significant backlash, especially against abortion rights following Roe v. Wade, but also the massive pro-choice rallies showing continued mobilization.
Protests against war persisted, too.
Yes. Zinn notes significant protests during the Persian Gulf War, suggesting maybe a shift in public thinking since Vietnam, less automatic support for military action.
Finally, he addresses the Columbus Quincentennial in 1992.
A moment where critical perspectives on Columbus and the consequences of European arrival gained much wider attention, challenging the traditional celebratory narrative. There were protests against exhibits, demands for alternative viewpoints.
And this led to a backlash.
Yes, accusations of political correctness, attempts to defend the traditional narrative. Zinn sees this as part of the ongoing struggle over historical memory, whose story gets told. He notes that many teachers were beginning to tell a different story about Columbus, reflecting the book's influence.
So, wrapping up, what are Zinn's concluding thoughts?
He remains fundamentally critical of the dominant powers, the state, corporations, the military. He acknowledges the immense power of the establishment and the frequent setbacks faced by people's movements. He sees capitalism as failing large segments of the population.
But is there any optimism?
Yes, cautiously. He emphasizes the importance of remembering the history of resistance, however small or seemingly unsuccessful. These moments show that people do fight back, that change is possible, often emerging unexpectedly. He stresses the power of seemingly ordinary people acting together. The potential for surprise, even in dark times, is a recurring theme.
So this deep dive into Howard Zinn's A People's History has taken us through a very different lens on American history.
Definitely focusing on those often left out of the main story.
We hope pulling out these key points, these arguments, these quoted moments, has given you, our listener, a solid grasp of Zinn's perspective and why it's provoked so much thought and debate.
It really challenges you to think about whose history we learn and why.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, building on Zinn's themes. If this tension between official history and people's history is such a constant thread, what does recognizing that ongoing struggle mean for how we understand and act in the world today?
That's a good question to ponder.
We definitely encourage you to explore the book itself, if this has piqued your interest. Consider the arguments, wrestle with the evidence.
It's certainly a book that makes you think.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
This deep dive was brought to you by Ben's Book Summaries.